Well, I just wanted to introduce the group. My name is Dr. George Nitzberg. As was noted, I'm an assistant professor of teaching at Teachers College, Columbia University, and my focus is really on the intersection of clinical psychology and technology. That's all areas of clinical psychology, and that includes areas that would be impactful for performance and performing artists. And the intersection of specifically how social media can impact performing artists and their performance anxiety was an area that really was, in my view, just so well led by the team of Sydney Lee, Max Bergner, and Jack Besser. So I'm going to let them take it away and present to you their findings on how social media is linked to performance anxiety in performing artists. So take it away, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Dr. Nitzberg, for that very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Sydney Lee. I am a former professional ballet dancer and actor, and I am accompanied by my lovely colleagues, Jack and Max, who both hold professional, collegiate, and scholarly expertise in performance psychology as well. For today's presentation, we're going to walk you through briefly a study that we investigated on social media behaviors and how it's related to performance anxiety. We'll talk to you a little bit about our findings, and then we'll give you real applicable ways to integrate them into your practice. Please feel free to leave comments in the chat, to write them down at the end, or even if you have comments, we'd love to connect with you after our presentation. Without further ado, Max, would you like to start us off and introduce our study?
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. So the overarching purpose of our study, as you've heard, was to explore performance anxiety, which we've defined as the product that manifests when a performer negatively evaluates or judges their own ability to meet the demands of their performance task and then views their performance pressure as a threat. And more precisely, what we were setting out to investigate was the influence of social media behaviors, specific social media behaviors, on performance anxiety and quality within what we found to be the under-researched cohort of high-performing individuals. Now, we also intended to evaluate the role of performers' engagement with their audience via social media platforms on their performance anxiety as well. Now, when we talk about these high-performing individuals, or HPIs, we're referring both to performing artists and athletes. And although performing artists and athletes can't uniformly be defined, they do share certain characteristics as their professions both involve high public visibility and audience engagement. Now, our HPI sample consisted of more than 100 performing artists and athletes aged between 18 to 64, although the mean age was around 23 years old. And a substantial portion of the respondents identified as actors, dancers, musicians, and singers. And additionally, these HPIs ranged in their professional performance levels, which further offered us a wealth of unique perspectives.
So before we kind of dive into all of our methods and our findings, we want to make sure we're all on the same page with how we're thinking about social media because it is definitely a hot button issue. It takes a lot of attention in kind of the public psychology space. And we really want to kind of hone in on this debate basically about whether social media is good or bad, how it might be affecting our mental health. So this popular narrative around social media usage, which many of you might be familiar with, The Anxious Generation. It's a book that came out in 2024 and talks a lot about potential negative consequences of social media use in kids, and it's led to a social media ban in Australia and different legislative concerns across the world, in fact. Um, but in the social media research field, the findings of that book have not been fully kind of substantiated. In fact, most of them have been widely contradicted. And Candace Odgers, who wrote the article also pictured here on the screen, has been studying social media use and digital technologies impact on adolescent development and really tries to hone in on that. If we're trying to get at the root causes of mental health issues, we have to think more specifically about the type of specific behaviors that might be impacting one's mental health when they're online, rather than thinking generally, oh, social media is this or that. And as well as considering a lot of the real world impacts of, whether that might be a family history of mental disorders, exposures to adversity, career, family, whatever type of stress that you might be experiencing in your life, before we really dive into what the online behavior is. It's kind of like an oversimplification if we just point directly towards social media. No, that's not me just saying we need to, stop pointing at social media as a potential cause of mental health issues. We have to think about it a little bit differently. So social media is not completely harmless. It's far from that. We need to be super specific about how it might be impacting it. So when we thought about social media use in our study, what we really wanted to get away from is this question of good or bad, and think instead of how does social media impact us in our specific context? So if we were worried about body image, for example, we would think, how could social media influence the way that we view our bodies? If we were worried about mood disorders, we would think about how social media might be impacting one's mood. Now, in our context with performing artists, what we were thinking is, how can social media be affecting performance anxiety? And we really kind of came up with these four main categories, and the fifth kind of expander into how it might impact you in ways that we didn't even consider. So what we thought about was displacement of practice time, where if you're spending extra time on social media, or you can't put that phone down when you should be doing maybe some practice on your own or some mobility work, whatever that might look like, you're spending that scrolling. We're also thinking about worsening practice quality because you have increased distractions. It's hard for you to be present, access that flow state that's so important for us. We think about increased stress due to constant communication, right? We all know that burnout feeling of an 8 p.m. email, 9 p.m. email when we're going to bed. Now, if you're seeing your competitors all the time on social media, that stress is going to be, pretty perpetual. So we worry about that. And then the last piece here is providing opportunities for social comparison. So if you're scrolling online and you're able to see what your competitors might be doing, what your peers might be doing, what other organizations are doing, it provides a lot of opportunities both for negative self-comparison and positive self-comparison, upward and downward, where you're constantly positioning yourself in relation to your peers, which could definitely connect to performance anxiety. And we also invite you to think about other examples from your own experience here, how performance anxiety might manifest in the online world, because it certainly isn't limited to these four categories. So with that in mind, what we did was create a specific measure called the Social Media Behaviors of Performers Scale to investigate these categories. And we broke it down into four main components. So the first is performance contingent self-presentation. So it's this idea of, if I perform poorly, I post on social media, or if I perform well, I post on social media. I start associating my online persona with my performance on stage. So how we really want to think about this is our performance, is our identity becoming further associated with our performance or with our activity, rather than being able to separate those two? And is that leaking into our online space? The next two are strategic self-curation and audience engagement and social capital, which we think of kind of as this influencer effect. So we were wondering how branding yourself as a dancer or a singer and building social capital around that might increase your pressure, because you now have this audience that has an expectation of you. So if those behaviors could manifest in, how you edit and portray yourself online. I edit and add filters before if I post pictures. And these are some examples of questions from the survey, by the way. And or I post about new equipment or merchandise I get for my activity or training. So you're trying to build some form of clout based off of the online experience that you're curating. And then our last category here is social comparison and self-monitoring. So that's looking at the posts and profiles of peers in their organizations. So this idea that you're maybe before a big competition, you're going to your competitors' accounts and you're looking at their profiles and seeing their routines, or if you're auditioning for a role and you know who might also be auditioning for that role, you're seeing what they've done. And by the time you get to the stage, you get to that moment of competition or performance, you've already built up this vision, this kind of deification of your competition that makes it really hard for you to compete with them because you're based solely off of that online persona that we know oftentimes is super curated and not super authentic to what that individual actually, who they actually are. And then the last piece that isn't represented in our scale because it was already existing, and another skill that we included in our study is the social media self-control failure survey. And that really gets at the displacement question that we were talking about on our last slide of, hey, am I giving into social media when I should be practicing? So we measured that here as well. So finally, kind of a brief overview of our findings before I hand it over to Sydney to talk through kind of the implications of our findings. We really found that social comparison is a significant predictor. So in the forecasting sense, we did a cross-sectional study in can assert causation here. But what we found is that we were able to model social comparison and self-monitoring behaviors as a pretty robust predictor of performance anxiety. And this type of behavior is widely supported in social media literature already, especially in the body image side of social media research, where there's a wealth of literature around that topic. And it is pretty notable, I think, especially given um, the connection of body image and eating disorders with dancers in particular, but other performing artists as well, that this behavior manifests in performance anxiety. Um, so the other last piece that we found too is that there is a displacement factor as well. We found some moderate correlations between displacement behaviors, giving into social media and performance anxiety as well. But out of our entire scale, the kind of unique predictor that did come out of this was social comparison and self-monitoring. So that's the base of evidence that we have here from our research, and I'll kick it over to Sydney to unpack it a little bit.
Thanks, Jack. All right, we have these findings now. Really, okay, why do they matter? Is this purely conceptual or can we put it into practice? I first want to speak a little bit to practitioners and coaches out there about why social media has become sort of central in the culture of being in the entertainment industry, and now why there might be some pressure to engage with it. So the first is for self, the second for career, and you'll see as I go along that 1 and 2 can be very intertwined, right? You have this identity enmeshment in which if you do well in your career, it makes you feel good about yourself as a person. But this third one is community and networking. When we're talking about the self, it's important to understand, and I'm sure many of us, if we're here, we have a very firsthand and personal experience with this, that opportunities in the entertainment industry can be very scarce. And even when they can be very unpredictable. You could be in a show one day and then the next day that show closes down. So in some ways, artists might use social media as a platform to sell their talents, to market themselves. And in this way, they actually become their own entrepreneurs. It can be a one-stop shop to send to casting directors, decision makers, executives, and you can really showcase your talents there. So one basic example would be if an actor has a Taekwondo skill, they post it on their social media, they send it to a casting director, and suddenly they're much more castable for an action film. And this way you're really making yourself more discoverable. You're helping people see more of you. The second is this growth aspect. And I think Jason talked a little bit about it in his last presentation, which was amazing. And it's that you don't get a lot of validation and feedback in the arts industry unless you're specifically going to take a class or you're being coached. In this way, artists might use social media platforms to post their performances and get that firsthand audience engagement. That audience might say, wow, I really loved this part of your pirouette, or ooh, I didn't really love this part. They're getting active growth in performance just by interacting with the virtual world. Second, employment and financial opportunities. In one way, Many creative artists might use social media as another source of revenue just to stabilize their livelihoods. They might monetize their platforms, and this might mean being an influencer, a content creator, or even taking brand deals to supplement. In other ways, casting directors, big companies, they might be exclusively releasing opportunities on social media. And it's becoming increasingly so, where, for instance, on Instagram, a casting director will have an open call, and actors that can see that opportunity will submit. So now we have this issue where social media could feel like a bit of a risk if you don't engage with it. You're missing out on opportunities. You don't know what's out there. And then the last is community and networking. Especially for early career professionals, it's nice to build peer networks and to start to normalize maybe the shared struggles of the industry, or to just reduce feelings of invisibility. In this way, they're really creating networks and friends and just a support system behind them. And then once maybe they have booked that job, they're performing, they're posting performances, suddenly they get to build a fan base through social media. It's a very visible space, and now this will not only increase perhaps show sales, but also their market value. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just want to show you a couple of the ways that you might recognize that these examples are happening on social media. So, for example, this violinist is publicizing her performance. An actor might might post his booked self-tape. He's highlighting a successful booking. He's enhancing his market value. This dancer is promoting her sense of growth. Maybe she wants validation from her audience. Maybe she's just looking to show people, hey, look, this is what I've done. Or maybe it's just for herself. And then, of course, here's the circus artist showcasing their skills. And as Jack was saying, clearly, it's not very helpful to write it off as good or bad. There are several benefits to this. It just matters in how we engage with social media. So our group has broken it down into 3 basic steps. The first is boundary setting. When and why are we using social media? The second is thinking about how social media use can be incorporated into perhaps goal setting or performance planning, making it a beneficial tool. And then third, once you're on social media, you're looking through those posts and you're scrolling, how are you ingesting the content that you're seeing? How can we reframe those cues into flexible and positive thoughts? So this first step is boundary setting. I think coaches and clinicians could really find this useful to help their performers clarify, first, when is it optimal for me to use social media? Second, how am I using social media? And that's the social media behaviors that we've alluded to in our study. And then third, why? Why am I using social media? And this will be in the next slide when we talk about an artist's values. According to our study, it might be helpful to understand what social media's behaviors are unhelpful. So based on our findings, for example, online stalking, the thing that many of us might do, you can raise your hand if you've definitely gone on Facebook and looked up someone else's profile, or looked up an opponent. Instead of online stalking, maybe we can replace that with just DMing friends, colleagues, or employers, in which now everything is very intentional and deliberate. Another example might be doom scrolling mindlessly and unconsciously. Just by a show of hands in the audience here, how many of us have caught ourselves scrolling mindlessly and then suddenly hours on end, we've noticed, oh boy, I've been here 4 hours. Okay, so then perhaps it's a matter of replacing mindlessly scrolling with an awareness of, let's cap it at 10 videos. That's a very reasonable boundary to have, and it's also increasing mindfulness and awareness. And then this when component, maybe before or after lunch in the middle of the day, maybe not right when you wake up when you're most susceptible, or right when you go to sleep when you're maybe ruminating as you're sleeping. Know yourself well. So I just also want to say really quick that boundary setting can sound intimidating and restricting, but I would reframe that to be, it's more freeing, in fact. And within these established parameters, you can confidently go through social media and use it without fear that it's maybe unconsciously or negatively impacting your mental health. Okay, so what does this mean? This means coaches, clinicians, know your artists well. And artists, if you're on here, know yourself well. And this starts with step 2 here. All right, so, let me go back. Okay, step 2. This is goal setting, post-planning. I think there's another talk going on right now, goal setting. We've all heard it. Okay, what does that mean? How do we go about doing this? We're gonna go through it briefly. First, this mindful performer reflection. This step can be very easily integrated into any kind of coaching session. For example, and I think Dr. Bradley Donahue might be here or he's somewhere around the conference, but he has an amazing program called TOPS. And within that program, you can very easily integrate social media planning within the goal setting or performance planning modules. Very easy step to just implement in. The first thing that we're gonna do in step 2 is to clarify our values. And to this end, I just wanna say one little example of how you can very easily do this. You can find a list of values on the internet. It could be Brene Brown's, it can be anyone that you find. You're gonna take a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and on one side, you're gonna put values more important to me right now, and then the other side is values less important to me right now. And that right now piece is important and quite timely because you're not saying that the value doesn't matter to you at all. It just may not be the most critical to your career at this moment. So once you sort all your values into the 2 columns, you're gonna take away the column that's values less important to me right now. You're just gonna focus on the column that's values more important to me right now, and you're gonna do the same process. You'll take that list of values and start to sort them more or less, more or less, more or less, until you find your top 5, even 3 values. Once you have your top 3 to 5 values, this can now start to inform actionable goals. You have a good sense of what matters to you and who you are. And ideally, you'll be able to answer how. How does this platform or post help me grow as an individual? Does this reflect my values? Does this post or platform even reflect who I authentically am? And then, do I want to highlight this post or performance right now? Perhaps it's important to you, but maybe a little further into the performance process in which it might have a bigger impact for viewers. If the answer to all 3 of these questions is yes, then you can really say confidently that you're acting in alignment with values. It's also just great to note that media and social media is a very visual sport, you could say. And as mentioned in the last talk by one of our wonderful audience members, artists are very creative and they're very emotional, and they can be very visual, maybe in ways that are not specifically athletic. So for example, colors. Colors and color schemes on social media could be a great way to represent your client authentically, while also capitalizing on the branding opportunity that is there. Another way to do that, if they're particularly creative writers, they want to add a tagline for themselves, an elevator pitch, they can put it in their bio. Almost every single platform has a little space for a bio, and it helps them to really use social media in a way that's positive and impactful. And then finally, once you've clarified your values and your goals, you're starting to brand and market yourself well, you can really make your platform stand out by identifying your character's strengths. This is done in a number of different ways, but I just want to highlight the VIA Character Strength Survey. It stands for Values in Action, which is exactly what we're talking about here. You can take that survey online, it's readily available. And then once it gives you your strengths, maybe you start to leverage them to really make your profile pop. So for example, one of those character strengths is humor. If you're particularly comedic, maybe you start to post content online that really captures people's attention because it makes them laugh. Similarly, you can write a comment that is maybe very sarcastic, but also very funny at the same time, really separating yourself from the crowd. Behaviorally, what does this look like? This is just one example. I'm sure in coaching sessions, it could be a little bit more colloquial, but here we have a very basic spreadsheet You have what the content is, the platform, the date, and then this probably most important column all the way to the right is your intent or value that you're trying to highlight. The basic goal here is just to strengthen the artist's confidence and authenticity rather than nitpick and promote perfectionism or comparison. So, once we're on social media, how are we ingesting that social media content? And this brings us to step 3 in healthy social media use. I'm specifically going to talk about REBT and CBT, which are ones that I've used the most as a performance coach. And my colleague Mac is going to talk about some other cognitive behavior approaches in the next slide. This first thing I wanted to talk about is cognitive restructuring and reframing. Some of our presenters have touched on this already. I really loved what they said about kind of rehearsing those new thoughts, and that is exactly what REBT and CBT highlights. So an example of this might be if they're ingesting a comment or a post and they're saying, oh, this person's just is always better than me. This sense of always, never, absolutistic notions. You can reframe that and say, wow, this person is really amazing at the craft. I'm amazing at my craft too. How wonderful. You can really start to change those thoughts. Coaches, if you're working with artists, you can identify how they're thinking in very specific linguistic cues. The demandingness, which means, I have to, I should, or I must. Albert Ellis, who created REBT, would make light of this with clients and say, please stop shoulding on yourself. Please stop masturbating. You're masturbating again. And that's just to say, I should or I must know how my audiences are rating me. I have to see how good my competition is. And he would start to dispute and say, do you have to go see that? I don't think you do have to. That's very high demandingness. Also self-downing, I mentioned absolutistic notions. I will never be good enough to succeed in this art. I always look less qualified compared to blah, 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 blah. Start to restructure that with different sayings, different thoughts, and a good way to do that is just to write it down and to constantly read them every day. Big tenet of REBT is embracing unconditional acceptance of self, others, and life. And I'm not going to go too deeply into this because we'll mention this a little later in this presentation, but a basic statement of unconditional self-acceptance might be, I would like people to enjoy this post, but I know that their reactions do not define my value. So you're accepting yourself wholly despite judgment, good and bad. Self-regulation techniques, we all think of mindfulness, meditation, yoga, things like this. Also journaling, reflection after social media use to just understand how you're feeling. My colleagues and I were talking about how sometimes we're on social media and we can feel ourselves getting more and more stressed as you're going through it. And if that's the case, stop right there. Just listen to yourself. And then this idea of shame attacking exercises. This is an REBT concept as well, in which you present something to the public with the goal of attacking your shame, feelings of guilt, or embarrassment. Basic example of this could be for an actor. Maybe an actor is attacking debilitating feelings of perfectionism, and so they post their audition mistake. It could be something that's directly meant to infiltrate feelings of feeling very perfectionistic, feeling very shrouded by those negative self-thoughts.
So yes, thank you, Sydney. So to supplement these approaches, these cognitive behavioral approaches, there are others that also serve benefits, such as exposure and response prevention therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. And these I have extensive experience with adolescent and emerging adult performers, and I've seen their effect. And so what ERP is it involves gradually exposing the client to discomforting thoughts, situations, while preventing the avoidance or other maladaptive behaviors such as reassurance seeking or excessive worry that they might engage in afterwards. Now, this is particularly effective for individuals who are experiencing social anxieties, such as performance anxiety, or even obsessive compulsive symptoms, which have been mentioned before about the intense amount of perfectionism that is rampant amongst our performers. And so ERP, when done correctly, can lead to habituation, which is an increased tolerance for this anxiety and these feelings of discomfort within these situations in which we need to be resilient. And hopefully, this eventually leads to a reduction in symptoms. Now, as do most interventions, exposures for performers inherently vary on a case-by-case basis. So, as Sydney has mentioned before, it's important that you know who you're working with. But for example, a dancer afflicted with performance anxiety could start by posting videos of their rehearsals without any filters or cuts or edits. And then, given the gradual nature of this type of intervention, over time, they can build up and increase the level of difficulty by posting a similar video, maybe without reviewing the comments or the likes for a certain period of time afterwards, sort of where that's that reassurance seeking behavior, where they're trying to see if other people agree with what they've done or if they see the reason why they did it. And now the objective of this intervention is not really to embarrass the client or subject them to any professional scrutiny. We don't want them losing opportunities or anything like that, but it's instead to foster a sense of learning that helps them face their anxiety head on, and teaching them to address specific behaviors that might be, without them really understanding at first, contributing to their distress in reality. And now another approach that again works as a supplement is ACT. And so, for those who don't know, ACT is a value-led and action-oriented intervention that encourages, as Sydney has briefly touched on, mindful acceptance and ongoing appraisal of one's situation, with the goal of promoting cognitive diffusion, the separation between oneself and one's own thoughts, and the ability to overcome challenges through psychological flexibility and resilience. So resilience is really a key component of both of these approaches, which is obviously really inherent for our performers. And so ACT interventions involve guiding the client through the identification and acceptance of their somatic experiences, their physical sensations, for example, during, before, and or after things like performances, auditions, rehearsals, and using these sensations as data or information that they can assess at a later time, rather than letting them dictate their actions in the moment, but using them to establish a plan when they show up in the future or when they find that they're showing up in the present. And the plan should be consistent with their values, which is most likely going to involve them combating the avoidance that they immediately feel with their goals that they've, as Sydney had talked about before, sort of previously outlined for themselves and understood within this present context. Now, this identification and acceptance also applies to their cognitions, their thoughts. And this involves their critical self-thoughts. The things we've talked about a lot is social comparison. And it's important that as providers, we help our clients view thoughts as cognitive events, right? Is this information or data piece again, rather than truths, because thoughts are really hard to diffuse from when you're the one doing them. So we have to sort of give a helping hand. And again, this helps when we have a value-led plan, so that we're using our values to guide everything, right? And so if we're using our values to dictate our actions, it's not that we're not acting in response, but we're acting more in a prepared manner. And we're less likely to be overcome by avoidance and the social influences that we're seeing constantly and repetitively online. Now, one of my favorite frameworks that I've been using with ACT is something called DNAV. And I'm going to oversimplify it just for time's sake, but it involves when someone's facing a challenge, it's a way and a framework to approach it. And so, for example, let's say a performer is frequently checking their competitor's social media page before they go to sleep at night, and it's interfering with their sleep schedule and most likely their performances. So the way DNAV would approach this is by allowing the client to discover, D, through trial and error, how this challenging behavior is impacting their life, right? What is it like when they do engage in this scrolling before bed? What is it like when they don't, or they do less, or they do more? And then implementing new skills when appropriate. So maybe they're doing meditation instead, or integrating a new sleep routine. And then the N stands for notice. They're meant to notice how they're feeling when they're doing this trial and error, to monitor how that's impacting their day to day, right? How is it impacting them the next day when they wake up after a morning of not scrolling compared to scrolling? And then lastly, the A, which is my favorite, is it stands for advisor or advising. And the best way I can explain this is to think about a boardroom of people sitting around a table. We are constantly inundated with our own thoughts, both negative and positive. And I like to think of it as a boardroom of people who have positive sensations or thoughts and criticisms of you. And it's up for us, or the person dealing with the challenge, to use their values to decide who they're going to listen to. So, where someone might say, oh, keep scrolling, you need to figure out what your competitor is doing. It's the only way for you to be prepared. Versus someone saying, hey, you're confident, you have the skills you need, it's time to get rest. So, the values at the core of this, which are the V at the end, are what allow the individual to sort of compass their way and decide which direction they're going to go and who they're going to listen to within their own mind and theory. So all this is to say, it is really important that we're keeping our clients aligned with their values, but also promoting them exploration. And the goal of all of this is not to get rid of symptoms. It's essentially to allow them to operate within the context of their anxieties because we want to promote resilience rather than that something is wrong because performance anxiety is so natural and so common. And so this has been sort of seen in my, I guess, supplement, my own experiences, but also research has been done in group settings with musical theater performers in experiencing audition anxiety, and more pilot studies have been done in recent years. And so we're really trying to help people face discomfort by sort of promoting these goal-oriented, value-oriented ideals. Now, for directors and instructors specifically, there's this concept called SMART goals, and we really want our performers to be free of social comparison when they're making these goals. And something I really appreciated Jason mentioned in his presentation was that it's more about the process than the actual, I guess, feedback. We get so much subjective feedback in this field that it's very hard to sort of hang your hat on how well you did, right? But if you can be confident in you've practiced 5 times a day, whatever it is, right? And you have specific, measurable, achievable but challenging and relevant to your value goals that are sort of based in a time frame that is reasonable, it is very much more easy. It's much more easier to be confident and steadfast that you are doing the work that needs to be done. And we're not promoting these further instances of social comparison through example. So, Jack, take it away.
Yeah, so the continuing kind of on some notes for directors and instructors, I wanted to talk about the idea of excuse me, co-scrolling and understanding your performer's digital landscape. So, I think we each have very unique experiences online that to us are like the normal experiences of what it means to be online. But the content that we get and the content that our performers are experiencing can range, pretty vastly depending on what platforms we're engaging in, depending on what algorithm kind of has been feeding us, the algorithm has been feeding us. So it's really important for us to kind of learn the messages that our performers are seeing when they're online. We shouldn't be assuming that our experience online is the same as our performers, or even from performer to performer, it's the exact same. And that starts with developing kind of a sense of online and digital empathy. What what a performer's experiencing deserves to be discussed in the same way that we talk about our competitors or preparation for performance in other ways. So can you scroll with your performers or understand what they're experiencing when they are online? Can you engage with curiosity? Candace Odgers, who I mentioned earlier as a leading researcher in the field, talks about how she raises her kids online in that they have some family scroll time where they look at content together and they're able to point out, oh, this skill is or this content is problematic for this reason. And that easily can be applied to performers in a similar way of hey, this is a skill you're seeing online that you might not be able to do now, but we can carve out a roadmap for that. I'm a college baseball coach here, and I deal with all the time of a player seeing an opponent being able to do something that they're not able to. And there's some jealousy, there's some negative self, evaluation. And by road mapping the way to get there, rather than viewing this as a threat, we can use this almost as an opportunity to say, hey, here's something cool that somebody's doing. Here's the way that we could get there together. And that only is possible with some form of digital curiosity and empathy with your performers. And similarly, if you see a routine or something that is posted that your performers are viewing as a threat, say you're going towards a dance competition and you see the routine of another troupe that's been posted online, and it's really good, and you can sense that there's some nerves in amongst your performers. Well, you can discuss, your strengths and your values, as Sydney mentioned earlier, and reframe this kind of to a validation of, hey, you're ready for this. You might be impressed by this, but understand that we're ready for this in a similar way, based off of my assessment of your skills. And so by having these open lines of communication, you're able to intervene before these moments become too big at the bright under the brightest lights at the biggest stages. So um just wanted to talk a little bit there about co-scrolling and understanding the digital landscape.
Nice. So I know that this room is primarily directed to clinicians, practitioners, and coaches, but if there are performing artists out there, we have a couple of notes that we find will be helpful for you. The first is that within our study, we did an exploratory test, and we found that between males and females, females scored higher than males on overall performance anxiety. Not only that, but they also reported higher use of nearly all the social media behaviors listed, once again, to the right here. The only difference is, this is where males come in. For males and females, they showed comparable levels of use for social comparison and self-monitoring. Okay, so what does this mean for you? Just be mindful. Just be aware that during formative years in which you're still developing perhaps your identity, your values, and your tastes, if you're engaging with social media mindlessly or unconsciously, it can exacerbate symptoms of anxiety and depression. And in fact, there have been studies that have verified that doom scrolling, for example, really impacts sleep. Not only initiating sleep, but maintaining it as well. And that could just be by the fact that you're staying up late at night scrolling when maybe you should be getting sleep. This last note here, our final takeaway from the four of us, is to use social media as a tool. Leverage it to your advantage. It's in the world, we can't ignore it, but how we use it is everything. We can use it to foster autonomy and agency, which often isn't within our hands being in the arts industry. And you can use it to support both your identity development and your narrative ownership. So it can be damaging, but social media can also be incredibly empowering when used well. I think this concludes our presentation here. Thank you so much for listening. We hope that you learned something new. Also, shout out to Dr. Nitzberg, again, Mitch, and the entire Performing Arts SIG for your support. If you have any questions or comments, we would be happy to receive them now. Yep.
I see one here. How can we more effectively promote community and collaboration versus comparison and competition on social media?
Yeah,
Um,
I have some thoughts too. Dr. Nisper, do you want to take that?
no, I think that one of the things that was notable for me as this work was being done was that idea of self-monitoring and social comparison. There was an interesting, as I was sort of over reading over those sort of those data that was coming through, I kept thinking back to the idea of was there monitoring of the production value of what is being put out there? Not these things are curated. Everybody's curating, and not everybody is taking the time to notice all the ways in which that curation is happening. And so it seems like this Like you are just a regular human, and you are amongst gods, right? And there is, I love the idea of co-scrolling so much because one of the things that I would point out to say to someone as I'm co-scrolling is, do you see what they did there? Do you see how they added? Do you see the filter they put on there? And also, did you see where they edited? Right. So a good example of this, although it's not performing artists, but it really highlights this, is there are influencers now on social media who do food reviews, and they've just started to notice it edits before they ever swallow. So they're doing food reviews, but never swallowing any of the food, right? And unless you're paying attention to that, you could read in to they get to eat whatever they want and never gain any ounce of weight, and I can't. Right? There's just it's so and it's so subtle you wouldn't necessarily notice it. So co-scrolling, especially with people who can have that third point of view, you're in the midst of it, but somebody else you can have a neutral point of view. That's so important. Um, and so the idea of community and collaboration, I would put it on, you know, if you are collaborative and in a community with people to help them do that, it's so hard to see. No one can see their own stuff. I cannot see my stuff, right? But we can help each other see the other's stuff. And to do that in a way that has tact and timing, that's the sort of thing that can bring about community and collaboration. And as it's noticed and put more, sunlight is the best disinfectant. As we notice these things, they go away, right? Because they're tricks at the end of the day.
Yeah. I would also like to add one thing to this comparison and competition part. And it's when I was working with competition dancers in California, when they see something on social media, having that third party point of view, like Dr. Nitzberg talked about, instead of seeing it as a mode for competition or comparison. So for example, for dancers, it might be, wow, she's so flexible. I'm not flexible at all. Maybe that's actually, if you turn it on its head, telling you something that you really desire to improve in yourself. And in this way, suddenly it's not a comparison or competition thing. It's, again, a tool to help you understand more about what you want to work on. So now it becomes, wow, she's so flexible. I just realized I really want to become more flexible. Let's institute ways to do that. So now you're making more actionable steps towards something that's helping your goals.
The last piece I want to add to this is depending on your role, if you're a coach or if you're working with coaches or instructors or directors, you have the opportunity to instill values in your group. And we often talk about conduct values, being on time, being prepared, doing the work outside of our sessions, but setting guidelines and expectations for how people are supposed to engage with one another online within that, whether that's within a orchestra, within a dance troupe, whatever that might look like, setting values for expectations of online behavior that are empowering, and creating community that's going to perpetuate itself outside of the rehearsal room or on stage, I think is really important.
Clark, do you have a question for us here?
Yeah, thanks, guys. This has been really enlightening for me. I'm curious, as far as a practitioner standpoint, a mental performance practitioner, when would be like, do we address social media as it comes up through the client's own, I guess, conversations with us, or is it something that we bring up? Like, when's the most ideal time to address social media behavior when working with performance anxiety? Is it like part of our intake or assessment? I don't know.
It's a great question. I have maybe a bit or like a note here, and it's better now than never sort of feeling. I don't think it needs to immediately be done on intake, but when you're beginning to plan for performance, for example, so maybe after the intake is done and you're working with a client, that would be a prime time to really address it. And then you can start asking questions like, are you on social media? How are you using it? How are you thinking about it? Things like that. And then suddenly you're setting yourself up on that performance planning, that mapping, getting to the performance where you have a very clear way of I think it was Jason or Dr. Kageyama at the beginning, thinking about where are you planting what you're thinking along the way. So it's probably right after the intake, right before you begin that performance journey. That would be my answer.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay.
Think then it's probably just about time for us to wrap up. This has been an absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure. And the clapping is huge in Zoom, I can tell. I think